Hello, respected viewers. It's George from Ireland. Hello there. So, thank you for coming back to the channel. And yet more joyous tidings for us this new year. I think it came shortly before Hogmanay, and that is that John Pilger has been summoned to his heaven, which is no doubt the great big torture chamber in the sky. Whereas he can have a nice time with his communist playmates from Fidel Castro to Mao Zedong to Ho Chi Minh and whatever, where this industrial scale slaughter can be perpetrated against the indigent in the name of Marxism. So that's John Pilger, who's died at the age of, was it 84? So he's an Australian British journalist for, my goodness, coming onto 30 years. So he's born in Sydney, Australia, into a middle class family, and he went from school straight into journalism. He never attended a university, and I suppose it showed in his writings from his lack of grasp of grammar and so on, and research methods. And of course, in the 1950s, it was not uncommon to leave school and immediately write for a newspaper, not attend university. Remember, university attendance, even in a country so advanced as Australia, was much, much lower way back in the 1950s. So, there were some plaudits for Mr. Pilger all through his life. And then he really tried to have it both ways. So he was an anti-establishment a journalist, but then how could he explain the fact that he was lauded with all these awards from the 1960s on for best writer, best journalist, best investigative journalist, and so on. So he carried off many glittering prizes, but somehow claimed to be an outsider. But in the last 10 years or so, his work only appeared in these websites which were propagating crackpot conspiracy, ultra-left views. But, not everything he said is twaddle. I'll never forget what it says in Henry IV, Part 1. I can't remember which character Shakespeare has saying this, but can the devil speak true? Well, he can. Even someone like this, who was really just a publicist for some of the cruelest tyrannies on earth, even he hit the mark occasionally. It's difficult to lie all the time. Even a broken clock is right twice a day. And actually, he was accorded rather more respect early in the career. When I have to hand it to him, he was on the money sometimes. And about 20 years ago, I used to read his bump quite regularly in the New Statesman. It may seem counterintuitive that someone of my political outlook, who's sort of a semi-libertarian, right-winger, conservative anarchist, would be reading his material and that indeed perusing that publication at all. But I'm always one who goes out of my way to expose myself to countervailing views. Could I be wrong? Maybe I should be at the side of this debate. And I often ask myself about that, the European Union, for instance, because I'm so cosmopolitan and so forth and so widely traveled. But anyway, back to Pilger. It was acerbic he really liked to lacerate. And then he was particularly applauded in the 1960s. He was reporting the conflicts in the quondam Indochina. And he was always taking issue with the United States foreign policy, said that no, they shouldn't uphold an open society in South Vietnam. They should allow Ho Chi Minh's demented cult of the personality to take over the whole of Vietnam, to have their sort of cleansing a society there, to execute thousands of people for being landlords just because they own a tiny bit more acreage than anybody else. So South Vietnam, it wasn't a democracy, but you could certainly, there was free trade. You had freedom in that kind of sphere to say what you want, eat what you want, drink what you want, wear what you want, leave the country and so on, travel freely around the country, none of which was applicable in the so-called Democratic Republic of Vietnam, as in North Vietnam, which was a sort of Maoist style hellhole. It was at least possible to get rich in South Vietnam, and the idea is that would trickle down, and that's what they've done. Then they follow the capitalist model. It's the only show in town. And Pilger, that's another point about him. Despite his supposed Marxist beliefs and incessantly pursuing this profession of denouncing the wickedry of capitalism, well, that didn't stop him enjoying its beneficence, because he liked to live high on the hog. And despite his much vaunted sympathy for the underdog and his compassion for the impecunious, no, that didn't mean that he gave a groat of his own to people who urgently needed it. No, he'd rather live in luxury. And despite having every sympathy with people in the less economically developed countries. No, he wasn't going to actually go and live in one of those, was he? That was for other people to suffer. So he was an extremely biased journalist, but he did report about the horrors of Cambodia. And here, I think, we see more or less eye to eye with him. Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge took over and was really horrific. You may have seen that film about the killing fields, which is little exaggeration, and it was genocide on a staggering scale. It's a considerable percentage of the Cambodian population was slaughtered by the Khmer Rouge in the name of so-called liberation. Now, Vietnamese communism was also tyrannical, but it wasn't quite on that scale as that of the Khmer Rouge. They had a year zero policy, returning to agrarian simplicity. They were going to purge all this bourgeois decadence, which meant all sorts of music and clothing and so on, just extremely viciously, violently, bloodthirstily oppressive. And so he did expose that. So that was fair enough. What he didn't like to say, and by the way, this is communism, slightly worse than the North Vietnam, but he really just had a soft spot for massive scale violence against unarmed people. And it's fair to say that obviously the United States and her allies in Vietnam, they'd fought, that had killed hundreds of thousands of people, quite a few of them civilians. And a lot of that was promiscuous use of bombs against areas with rather few enemy combatants, and an awful lot of civilians were killed that way. All right, so the Khmer Rouge's opponents were not much more humane like this. So for John Pilger, the United States could really do no right. And actually, his boyhood hero was Wilfred Burchett, an Australian British journalist who was very much a mouthpiece for communist tyrannies in North Vietnam. One of the very few Western journalists who was trusted in Mao's China, as well as in not North Vietnam, North Korea, and so on, because he was simply regurgitating their propaganda with no attempt to fact check it. Anyway, so what else about dear old John Pilger? So he moved to London in the early 60s, and that was really his base, but he went around to Southeast Asia quite a lot. And he did report a lot on the Indonesian invasion of East Timor in the early 70s. That is true, and that is horrific. And a large percentage of the East Timorese civilian population was butchered by the Indonesian military. That is correct. The United States green lighted it. The United Kingdom was cognizant that this was about to transpire, and Her Majesty's government did not raise its voice in protest. Then again, what could the UK do? It could have really spoken out against it, but as the United Kingdom had withdrawn from Southeast Asia almost entirely, something Pilger wanted to see happen, the UK was in no position to prevent it. Just had a few hundred troops in Brunei to try and persuade the Indonesians not to invade there. They're going to invade somewhere else. Well, that was not doing British foreign policy any disfavors. I suppose the Americans, the Brits, and so on, and Australians didn't want to see East Timor already in a civil war falling into communist hands, which might otherwise have done. But admittedly, what happened under Indonesian rule turned out to be worse. So Pilcher was very vain, and he had his own face on the front covers of most of his books, which tells you a lot. A bit of an egomaniac. So he published several books which were quite well received, and I will acknowledge the readability of much of his work. So he had a bit of a cult following, was almost up there with Noam Chomsky in far left circles. But he was someone who was willingly gullible when it came to swallowing propaganda from regimes for which he had a particular weakness. But he was not averse to racial epithets, saying that Barack Obama was a glossy Uncle Tom and things like that, which is obviously a rebarbative thing to say. He said that Donald Trump was not quite as bad as Hillary Clinton. Now, I mean, I despise and revile Hillary Clinton, but Trump's even worse. He said, well, because Trump doesn't want a war against Russia. And that's the guy who was a leftist, then had a soft spot for Putin. I mean, who espoused leftism at the time, but Putin's really a rapacious capitalist. This is not a free market under him. It really is a gangster state, and he thinks that's fantastic. And there's something very, very well documented. There are extremely large-scale human rights abuses under Putin's regime, and the murders his regime has committed abroad, and these illegal wars of unprovoked aggression he started. Pilger was really an across-the-board defender of Putinism, and claiming there was going to be no Ukraine war. Well, he's dead wrong about that one. Claiming that the poisoning of Sergei Skripal, that the whole thing was a hoax perpetrated by the media and stuff like that. He said that there was no genocide against Kosovar Albanians. So just telling flagrant lies. So much of what he said has been completely debunked. So and he was someone who would tell lies of omission as well as lies of commission. So he's really no loss to journalism, and it is true that in some he did make some laudable documentaries like Death of a Nation about East Timor. He kept that issue in the public eye, and eventually freedom came to East Timor under the auspices of the United Nations in 1999. But so there he was against the United States saving Muslims in Kosovo and claiming they were anti-Muslim, and against the United States saving Muslims in Iraq and Afghanistan and so forth, calling himself an anti-imperialist. I remember him saying that that liberal left leaders were really industrial scale killers, were even worse than the conservative politicians who tended to be a little bit more skeptical about Gladstonian interventionism. So that is John Pilger. He briefly edited the News on Sunday in the mid 1980s, a far left newspaper that sank without trace. So yeah, he got worse as he went on. Really, what can I say? So John Pilger, well, I'm rather glad he's gone. That's it. May we never see his like again. And he's claiming that the West had overthrown a lawful government in Kiev in 2014, and indeed there is a measure of truth to that. But that NATO had gone right up to Russia's border. Well, that, I mean, obviously it had elsewhere, not in Ukraine, still not a member of it. But Russia invaded Ukraine and not the other way around. Had been invading it for a very, very long time. So he really was despicable. So that is John Pilger. But some of his books, like Hidden Agendas, it does talk about some quite shocking episodes in American foreign policy. As a young colleague of mine said, that even if only a tenth of that is true, is still scandalous. Well, thank you so much for watching my channel. Make sure you subscribe on Patreon and donate on PayPal to georgecallahan79@gmail.com. Urgently need your donations to keep the channel sustained. Toodaloo.